A huge terrorist attack in Algeria kills more than 80 people, and Canadians are allegedly amongst the perpetrators. Joining us now from Ottawa to talk about this is our friend David Harris, a director at INSIGNIS Strategic Research. Hey, David, welcome back to the show.
Thanks a lot, Ezra.
Now, it may be unsettling for Canadians to hear the allegation that one of our own was a terrorist leader, but actually there have been many instances of Algerian Canadian terrorists. Can you name a few for us?
Well, I mean, the fact is that we were designated probably the best part of 15 years ago by the then leading French counterterrorism magistrate, Louis Bergier, as a hub of North African Islamist international terrorism. You'll recall that the notorious Ahmed Razam, who was a refugee claimant, an unsuccessful one in Canada, actually moved explosives from Canada to the U.S. with a view to blowing up the Los Angeles airport.
So that's the so-called Millennium Bomber. So he was caught
precisely
sneaking in from B.C. to Washington State. Are there any other connections with Algerian Canadians and terrorism?
Oh, indeed. Rassam was actually a limited part of a much larger network, and this became known as the group Fatah Kamel. This was essentially, again, an Algerian-based group. They were established in Montreal and involved in international Islamic extremism by way of providing support, fraudulent documents, some suggest recruiting and financing for international operations. The elements of that group, the key ones, were prosecuted successfully in France and did jail time, but its leader, Fatah Kamel, wound up returning to Canada after all of that. So we've got a well-established, well-entrenched, and unfortunately building reputation for these kinds of connections and activities.
That's incredible. Now, CSIS has released some documents through Access to Information which shows their scan of the threat environment in Canada over the next dozen years, and we've got on the screen that PowerPoint. You want to take us through some of these slides that are of particular importance. We're looking at one right now, David. Tell us, this talks about the insider threat. What does that mean, the insider threat?
This is a term that appears more than once in those CSIS slides, and it has certain sinister qualities about it. What it essentially suggests is that you have been, as a country, perhaps even as a government, as a police service, as some other important entity, infiltrated and penetrated, that you're in some way perhaps under the influence of the enemy. And these concerns can relate to a variety of things where Islamists, that is radical Muslims, are able to gain some kind of presence within a police force. We've had all sorts of warnings from moderate Muslims in Canada about that very issue, which they feel is manifest already. But it may be as well within certain government circles, whether municipal, provincial, or other. We've seen warnings from, of course, CSIS Director Fadden a few years ago with his special reference to China. So there you have the foreign influence aspect.
Now, I want to look at another slide. I think it's page 8. On the CSIS slides, the weapons of mass destruction threat. Now, that's not something I have thought would really target Canada, but now that I think about it, why wouldn't it? Why would Toronto be any less immune to a WMD attack than New York? What do some of these acronyms mean? What do you think they mean by the CBRN terrorism? What would that even stand for?
Well, that refers to chemical, biological, nuclear, and radiological terrorism. And of course, some of that is self-explanatory, but the radiological is useful to highlight because it implies that without having an active, effective nuclear warhead, you can spread all manner of radiological nuclear contamination. Perhaps you might have some elements that have been made available, maybe leaked through certain kinds of medical facilities and been attached to an ordinary conventional explosive. When that goes off, it can spread all kinds of this sort of material around. And in an age when we're very worried about the weapons and material of mass destruction proliferating, this is becoming a real threat. To the extent that we're seeing some areas, and this was signaled in some of the CSIS slides, of the world now falling into mismanagement, into chaos. We have the possibility that centers can be developed in those locales where these sorts of weapons can themselves be developed and move around without any kind of real risk of monitoring by Western or other allied forces.
There's one more slide I want to get to. It's slide number 3 of CSIS, and it talks about demographic trends. I mean, it's interesting to me. Here's what they say about Canada. Canada's more diverse, but more segregated in that diversity. There's ethnic ghettos. They call it enclave dynamics with social and security implications. I mean, I think of something we've talked about on this show a lot. There are some high schools in the Greater Toronto area that are overwhelmingly Muslim. They turn their cafeterias into mosques on Fridays. They have Sharia law. They segregate the boys from the girls, and even the girls who are having their period from their other girls. Like, this sounds like Saudi enclaves in Toronto. Now, that's peaceful Sharia law, but if you've got these kind of enclaves, maybe that generates Islamic radicalism that might manifest itself violently. Is that what CSIS is getting at there?
There's long been a concern among intelligence circles about the so-called transmission belt that takes people as groups or individuals from sympathy for radical ideology of a nonviolent nature all the way through then the spectrum and winding up possibly at extremism and then the violent manifestations we're especially worried about. So this is part of a larger kind of piece. And it's worth mentioning that Statistics Canada a few years ago had indicated that according to their definitions of enclaves, we had moved from perhaps a small handful of what they thought of as enclaves around 1980 to, I think, hundreds then. And this seems to be growing at a tremendous rate, thanks primarily to the kinds of mass immigration that we're seeing, and then that multicultural interpretation that we in Canada peculiarly seem to be pressing upon ourselves.
Yeah. David, we're out of time. I appreciate you bringing these CSIS slides to us. God willing, it'll just stay theoretical, but I have a feeling that these things will become real if we keep on the course we're on. Thanks for talking to us today.
Thanks, Ezra.
Bye-bye.